I'm Stanley Painter with Court TV, and I've been talking to True Crime Rocket Science.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Good morning and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Nothing will change, no weight will be lifted. I have no options because I'm a ghost, a shell. I never had a chance or a family. These are Brian's words written in October 2018. The fact that the 23-year-old was found with him in October 2021 reveals just how much his past was still his present. Months before he started dating Gabby, Brian was already a real piece of work who described himself a year prior to that as manic and messed up. He wrote, "About a year ago, I went into a type of mania where I was smashing holes in the wall with my head, kicking through paintings, tearing whatever I was working on, pouring gasoline on myself to burn alive, but getting the lighter wet, parking out in Murderland, listening to," unclear what is written there, and it gets worse. Talks about holding a gun and talks about wrestling alligators. That last part really seems a bit far-fetched. This channel, you may remember, was the only channel that actually dealt with Brian's reading choices in any real detail. I went so far as to buy some of the books we saw Brian reading, such as Lullaby, and so did some other TCRS members. I remember it being a very disturbing book, even as someone who writes a lot, writes about true crime, and found it a very disturbing book. So did some of the other people who bought it and read it as well. And you can only imagine what kind of effect that has on sort of a young person's mind, especially someone as immature as Brian Laundrie. In this analysis, we're going to revisit Brian's psychology, something we dealt with when we covered the Gabby Petito case, but in a lot more detail and with a little bit more additional evidence and also his words to guide us. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Check out my new book cover for Neverest 2. I'm sure you'll see it's a great improvement on the first one. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. One of the comments you can leave is at the end. I ask if you want me to take this whole conversation further. So please make sure you address that at the end of the video. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. It was abundantly clear from Brian's art posted on Instagram and from books we saw him actively reading during that fateful doomed summer, that summer epic that he spent with Gabby in the van, that he had an unhealthy fixation. Chuck Palahniuk's work. Watch Fight Club a few times and you may get a real sense of how the themes of nihilism, violence and masculinity, psychosis and repression, and self-destructive attempts to escape consumerism have been absorbed by this young man's disturbia, seemingly wholesale.
What kind of dining set defines me as a person? This is your life, and it's ending 1 minute at a time. I prayed for a different life.
Soap. I make and I sell soap.
In Fight Club, self-destruction is elevated to an almost grungy, gritty level of cool. Being cynical and fucked up is almost presented as fashionable, and that one is cerebral and smarter than everyone else because one is simply aware of the pressing burdens of artifice in the world. It's almost as though if you're dysfunctional, you're actually more human than everyone else. Except we see here with Brian that he was hanging on by a very thin thread, like the character in Fight Club, and likely his entire relationship with Gabby was an act, a confidence trick, and one she was likely increasingly seeing through the more time they spent together at close quarters. Are you ready to be shocked? In virtually every true crime case, there's a simple antidote that, had the perpetrators been injected with it, and I mean a kind of psychological injection, the crime and the criminal impulse would have simply fizzled away. What am I talking about? I'm talking about self-esteem. Ernest Becker writes, "When people do not have self-esteem, they cannot act. They break down." Think about the likes of Chris Watts, Jodi Arias, Chad Daybell, Casey Anthony, Scott Peterson, even O.J. Simpson and Oscar Pistorius, also Amanda Knox. Had these people been able to achieve any sense of genuine self-esteem at the time their world seemed to be exploding, they would have likely made far better decisions. And Brian Laundrie too. In his diary entry, Brian rails against his parents. He writes, "They already did this already. Also, it's been 2 years of waking up completely unsure." And yet, how he seemed to deal with his angst was by childishly lashing out at walls, kicking paintings, and basically being a drama queen inside his own drama. We actually see some of that in the parking lot on the day Gabby died, where he really slams that van door closed. And you may remember, even in his water-stained confession, he partially blamed Gabby for her own death. He wrote, "I ended her life. I thought it was merciful, that it is what she wanted. But I see now all the mistakes I made. I panicked. I was in shock." One has a horrible sense here that Brian's reality was so warped by his own mental malaise and also by the warped narratives he was nourishing himself with, that he somehow took reality. It's almost as though he took inspiration from this and then took reality and twisted it into his own horror story, one that ultimately consumed him as well. So, what is the antidote to all this? If one is a victim and experiences one's life as the life of a victim, where is the way out? What's the answer? The answer is self-esteem. Not blaming others, not getting back at others, but getting one's own grasp of one's own sense of self back. And that comes with agency, and with that comes agency. Brian had no agency. Jodi Arias had no agency. Chris Watts had no agency. Chad Daybell had no real agency. Even O.J. Simpson, a wealthy celebrity with tremendous resources, felt empty and alone, rejected and pitiful when his ex-wife simply didn't invite him to a family get-together. Because O.J.'s self-esteem was artificial, as was the case with many other people. So why did Brian have no agency? Why did Chris Watts have no agency? Why did Casey Anthony have no agency? Why? Because they all suffered from low self-esteem. Low self-esteem isn't someone else's fault. It's also not someone else's responsibility. It's yours, primarily. Obviously, there's an area where if you stay in a relationship, someone can break down your self-esteem, but at the end of the day, it's your responsibility. Fix self-esteem and suddenly the picture changes. Suddenly you are responsible for guiding and managing your own psychology. Not a lover, not some person you're rubbing shoulders against, not your boss, not your parents, not the world, you. As soon as you remember that, you regain power and control over yourself and your life. As soon as you forget that or lose your self-esteem, well, you really lose everything. Under the mattress I'm on is a loaded .357 Magnum revolver. A pull of the trigger and all my problems will be over. That's something else Brian Laundrie wrote. This is an attempt by Brian to escape and avoid life because life is simply too painful for him to deal with. And so he doesn't deal with it. He avoids it. It's too painful because Brian has never learned to deal with life on its own terms. How can you deal with life if you're always running away from it? How do you practice or improve your efficacy if it's never tested? How do you develop self-esteem if you're portraying yourself as the passive victim of your own story, where everyone else has all the power and they're all to blame and you have none, rather than you are the hero who has gone on some challenging adventure, had some interesting experience and returned with some gift, a gift of lived experience to share with the world. You can't do that when you're the victim of your own story. Part of the answer to the road back to self-esteem Genuine self-esteem is authenticity. Practicing being yourself in the real world and also refining yourself, improving yourself. It's about facing your fears. And what was Brian's fear? Well, in an undated diary entry, Brian Laundrie described a nightmare. It may even have been a recurring nightmare he had, which was about Gabby leaving him. I do think Brian was haunted by the nightmare that Gabby might leave him. Why? Because it was realistic. It was likely. It was inevitable. And so Brian wrote, "The ocean pours out of her blue eyes and the fire is out. With one word, the pain is gone. Brian. Oh, how sweet she is to say we should get together, but you know when you walk out that door, she'll be gone forever again. You're back in the car, haunted by the eyes you'll never look into again. The pain burns fresh because you know it's just tonight. You wake up and you're both free." And that really does feel like some of the brainlessness in some of the narratives that I think he was reading. And so when the nightmare actually happened, it was so much worse because he'd seen it coming, feared it coming, was terrified of it, was almost toying with the terror. And this fear and terror was slowly turning him, this pathetic pile of low self-esteem, into a monstrous turd. It was always so clear, but it's even clearer now. If Brian couldn't have Gabby, and he couldn't, by the time they got to the Grand Tetons, he really had lost her. But he was losing her, he was already losing her by the time they were stopped in Moab. But if he couldn't have her, no one could. If he couldn't live without her, she had to be controlled and managed, threatened and bullied, undermined and manipulated. And no one can live like that. No one can live with a person like that. This absolute way of thinking, also within a victim mindset, where someone pays the price of not loving you, and this is when you can't even love yourself, it's a classic sign of low self-esteem. And this is why this whole idea of narcissism doesn't really work if you say, well, low self-esteem is okay. Anyway, we will get to that. I will emotionally blackmail you into treating me the way I want to be treated because I can't muster up the self-esteem myself to be worthy of respect. What is it when you can muster up self-esteem? What do you call that? Instead, it's, I don't deserve you and that hurts me. That's painful. And so my revenge is to hurt you. That's my only option. That's my only card that I can play. That's the only arrow in my quiver. My revenge is to hurt you. And somehow that becomes what he thought Gabby deserved. These are Brian's words. I thought it was merciful that it is what she wanted, but I see now all the mistakes I made. You can only devolve into this fucked up way of thinking, this victim mindset, if you have zero self-esteem. Now, according to one article, other items the FBI collected include hundreds of bullets, several magazines, a bill of sale, and handbooks for a Ruger .380 and a Glock 49. These were pistols, and then also a compound bow fitted with a rifle scope. Reading material found included copies of The Watchtower, an illustrated religious magazine published by New York-based Jehovah's Witnesses, and then also Chuck Palahniuk's novel Choke, about a scam artist who pretends to choke on food to earn sympathy checks from others. But basically, it's about an artist who pretends. If you don't have self-esteem, how do you get it? Do you want to talk about that? Let me know in the comments. I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.